Hello, my name is Michael Smook. Today is July 7th, and we're in the year 2018. And it's a Saturday. I'm speaking to you from my home in Forest Hills, New York. Forest Hills is in Queens County, which is an outer borough of the city of New York. The topic of today's talk, it's episode 26. It's entitled, Are We Safe Now? In summary, what we're going to talk to do today about what happened on September 11th, 2001, where the United States was attacked by not a nation state. We were attacked by a terrorist organization few Americans had ever heard of. This is part one, and then next Saturday, and then the following Saturday, we'll be covering parts 2 and part 3, and then we'll be completed with this talk. So on that day, the United States, we had a terrorist attack, and it shocked the nation, and we're going to discuss what happened on that day and events that transpired afterward and suggested remedies to help America move forward and heal. And the underlying premise of today's talk is that based upon this terrible day, what's happened within the United States, we were facing a form of shock, or you could call it atrocity trauma. And that's the underlying premise of today, is that this is something America has been dealing with for the past 17 years. I believe we've healed quite a bit, but there still is a residue of psychological trauma that ties into much of what we do even today. So that about covers what Chapter 1 is about. Chapter 2 is entitled 9/11 What Happened. 9/11 What Happened. When the United States was attacked by this terrorist organization very few Americans had ever heard of, called Al-Qaeda, it was done surreptitiously. It's a plan that was practiced many months, perhaps years in advance. 19 men committed these terrible terrorist attacks, generating murder and mayhem and property destruction in New York and Washington, D.C., and causing the United States to be in a state of shock for a while. This is how they did it. 19 men broke into teams of 4 or 5 men per team, and they hijacked jet airliners in different airports throughout the Northeast. These jet airliners, 2 of them American Airlines, 2 of them United, they were fully laden with fuel. This is a well-coordinated attack. 2 jets were headed to New York on suicide missions. The first jet crashed into the upper reaches of the World Trade Center, that's the North Tower. And then the second jet crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. And within 2 hours, both towers came down, and 11 buildings were also damaged, destroyed in the carnage that took place. And then 2 other jets were headed to Washington, D.C. 1 jet crashed into a part of the wing of the Pentagon in Washington, and the 4th jet crashed in Pennsylvania outside a township called Shanksville in Pennsylvania. And our intelligence sources said that jet was headed towards either Capitol Hill or the White House. Now, all these attacks were crashing jets into iconic buildings, killing the crew, the pilot, the passengers, and of course the terrorists. The attacks in New York City were done for a specific purpose, because New York City is considered the unofficial financial capital of the United States, and it's one of the most important cities in the world in terms of finances. The World Trade Center is considered the northern border of what has been referred to as Wall Street, and Wall Street is synonymous with wealth, the United States' wealth as the world's only superpower. So the attack on New York and World Trade Center buildings was an attack on America's financial wealth. The attack on the Pentagon was specific for a reason. because the Pentagon is the military headquarters of the U.S. Armed Forces. If you add the amount of funds that are budgeted towards the military on an annual basis, the U.S. military is greater than the combined budgets of Russia, China, Great Britain, France, and India. So the United States is the largest military in the world and arguably the most powerful. And then the missions that failed, at least from the terrorist point of view, to crash a jetliner into Capitol Hill or the White House, they're symbolic of America's power. Post Cold War, what's happened is that the United States is arguably the world's only superpower, and that the White House and Capitol Hill are symbolic of America's financial, military, political, and diplomatic power. So all of these attacks against symbols of American power were done for a specific reason by this terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda. I remember that day very well. I was 3 to 4 blocks from Ground Zero, and when the South Tower imploded, I walked 1 block west, and I looked skyward, and I could see the North Tower with smoke billowing out, and it was a sorry state. And then I looked street level, and I could see approaching me were individuals in groups of 2, 3, and 4 huddled together yet walking forward. And what struck me is that just about everyone in these groups, they were covered from head to toe with soot, and they walked towards me and then past me. These were survivors of the terrorist attack. So it was a horrific day, a terrible day, a day that I'll remember the rest of my life. What about Al-Qaeda? What do they stand for, and what is their motivation? Al-Qaeda is a group that my interpretation is they possess a philosophy that's nihilistic, which meaning they care little for human life if it gets in the way of their objectives, and it's a toxic version of a monotheistic faith known as Islam. And so what we're talking about is they're not representative of Islam. That's 1.6 billion people that shares. It's a monotheistic faith that shares a great deal with Christianity and Judaism. The same ethics and philosophies overlap between all 3 monotheistic faiths. So Al-Qaeda pays lip service to Islam, but they are not Islam, and they're a terrorist organization, and that's what I'm defining what they're about. In terms of what their ultimate goal is, why did they attack the United States? And I think that the attack of the United States was really part of a grander plan. Attacking the United States was to land, in boxing parlance, land a powerful body blow against the United States and against the symbols of its power. But what the real message was, the real goal is Al-Qaeda and future terrorist organizations like ISIS. What they want to do is they want to undermine, and then overthrow the nations of the Arab nations that make up their homelands in the Middle East. And I'm thinking that what they wanted to do is they wanted to undermine and overthrow the nations of Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. This Al-Qaeda, although 15 of the 19 terrorists were from Saudi Arabia and the other 4 from other Middle East countries, they didn't identify themselves as nationals from these nations. They identified themselves as members of Al-Qaeda. And the training base for Al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan. And they were given safe haven by the government of Afghanistan, who were ruled at the time by a group known as the Taliban. So that about summarizes what I believe. This is my interpretation of what the motivation for the surprise terrorist attacks. And in terms of damage done, uh, 3,000 people were killed. And if you factor out the 19 terrorists who died in these suicide attacks, the nearly 3,000 people who died this day, we can state that they were murdered. 6,000 people were wounded, $100 billion in property damage, and trillions of dollars of loss in the stock markets in the United States and around the world. What the United States was feeling that day, I remember those days very well, and from our leadership through the American people, what we were feeling was a sense of shock, fear. As the death toll mounted, what we were going through was a sadness and mourning. And then over time, I can't quantify it, but somewhere between some and many Americans, there was talk of an articulation that we needed to strike back on the terrorists who committed these atrocities. And the underlying premise of all of what was going on is, the underlying premise of today's talk is that America was suffering on that day and in the days, weeks, months, years following a form of 9/11 shock, or we could call it atrocity trauma. And I think that when you're going through this kind of stress, you make hasty decisions that could be done dispassionately, calm, methodical, and I think that's some things we were lacking. And for the remaining chapters, we're going to discuss next Saturday and the following Saturday. This is a 3-part series. What I'm going to suggest to you is, what do we need to do to think in a more methodical fashion in future talks? So in particular, next Saturday, which is the talk of part 2 is entitled Misadventures in the Middle East. And even though I do not approve of the way the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq following 9/11 were prosecuted, this is less a criticism of George W. Bush and his administration. It relates more to the fact, as a child in my adolescence and my teen years, I had to live through the Vietnam War. I would watch it. There was no cable TV, no internet in those days. I would watch it every night. Walter Cronkite would deliver the news, and the United States was militarily and politically and diplomatically engaged in what is frequently referred to as a quagmire, even though we had superior military capabilities. So there was a frustration with Vietnam, and then with 9/11, even though the wars are winding down in Iraq and Afghanistan, what's going on now is we still have military personnel there. There still is some fighting. There still is disharmony. And so what I'm going to talk about next week is we'll discuss a methodical, systematic, dispassionate view of how the United States could manage its foreign policy today and in the future. We can't undo the past, but we can be much more systematic in the future. And the two concepts we'll talk about next Saturday are the concept of the virtual microscope and the reverse timeline. These are philosophies that I've shared with you in previous YouTube talks, but they bear mentioning again. And then 2 weeks from today, what we're going to talk about relates to the rise of the surveillance state and the need for privacy protection. Inherently, there is a tension between the two. How can we keep the homeland safe, and at the same time, how can we at the same time protect our Bill of Rights, Fourth Amendment privacy protections against search and seizure without probable cause and without a warrant? And those are things we're going to talk about. We'll also talk about, in the future, how we could better prepare for a 9/11, and what I'm thinking about is devoting greater resources towards resiliency. And this aligns with my philosophies in the previous YouTube talks, many of the 25 in the past, and it also aligns with a scholar at Tufts University, Fletcher School of Diplomacy, Professor Monica Duffy Toft, and I'm going to be quoting from her as well. So that summarizes, we've spoken about what we're going to talk about. We not only spoke about what we spoke about today, we just summarized what we're going to talk about next Saturday and the following Saturday for this 3-part talk. One more comment before we start to close. What I've been talking to you about relates to what I consider to be American issues. These are not exclusively Democrat, Republican, conservative, or liberal. They're American issues. We're all Americans, and we're all in this together. So that's something that I try to keep in mind, because I think that creating win-win situations, crossing the ideological divide, and keeping our homeland safe are paramount in my underlying philosophies. So my name is Michael Smook. I'm speaking to you from my home in Forest Hills, New York. Forest Hills is in Queens County, which is an outer borough of the city of New York. Today is July 7th. It's a Saturday, and we're in the year 2018. This is episode 26. We post on YouTube, Facebook, and sometimes Vimeo. The topic of today's conversation is, are we safe now? This has been part 1, and soon we'll be talking more about parts 2 and 3. So until next time, goodbye. And until next week, goodbye. And good luck.